She was supposed to be safe. That's what everyone around her believed. That's what they told themselves, and for a long time, nothing came along to challenge it. Life kept moving. Days turned into weeks. The case settled into the background, quiet and undisturbed, like a room at the end of a hallway that nobody had the courage to open. Then something changed, not slowly. Not in the gradual way that most things shift. It happened the way certain truths eventually do, all at once, without any warning, in a way that made people stop mid-sentence and ask questions they hadn't thought to ask before. Questions that once spoken out loud couldn't be taken back. Nancy Guthrie had been someone's daughter, someone's neighbor. Someone that people in her life still remembered clearly, still thought about in the quiet moments. Her story had traveled in whispers through courtrooms, through careful conversations between people who couldn't quite name what felt wrong but knew, somewhere underneath everything, that something was. And now, after months of those whispers going nowhere, after what felt like years of waiting for something to move, something has surfaced. Something that investigators are describing as significant. Something that people close to the case say they never expected to see come forward. Not now, not at this point. The details are still being carefully assembled. The full picture hasn't formed yet. But what has already emerged is enough to pull the entire story in a new direction. Who knew what when they knew it? And whether the version of the truth that was supposed to protect Nancy ever really had a chance of doing that. This is not a story that has ended. It is a story that has quietly, without any announcement, begun again. There are cases that arrive loudly and leave quickly. The cameras show up, the headlines run for a few days, and then the world finds something else to look at. People move on. The case becomes a file number, a date on a document, a name connected to something that was never fully resolved. Nancy Guthrie's case never quite worked that way. It lingered. It stayed with people, the ones who followed it from the beginning, the ones who lived close to it, the ones who felt in their gut that the official story didn't quite add up. Not because they had proof, because they had instinct. And instinct, in cases like this, is sometimes the only thing that survives when everything else has been carefully buried. By most accounts, Nancy was a woman who lived an ordinary life. She wasn't famous before her name started appearing in reports and case files. She hadn't sought attention or controversy. She was simply a person, someone with daily routines, with relationships that mattered to her, with a world that held together the way most people's worlds do. Built quietly on trust and the assumption that the people around you are who they appear to be. That world, according to those who knew her, wasn't without its difficulties, but whose is? What began to matter, what eventually began to matter enormously, was what happened when that world started to come apart. Not loudly, not in any way that drew attention from the outside. It happened the way real fractures often do, slowly and privately. A conversation that didn't quite add up. A timeline that, when someone looked at it carefully, didn't hold the way it should. A version of events that sounded reasonable right up, until someone asked one question too many. Investigators, journalists, and people close to the case have spent a long time working the edges of what is known and what has simply been assumed. That kind of work doesn't make the news. It happens in quiet offices, in file rooms, in late phone calls between people who haven't let go. It is patient, careful, and most of the time invisible, but it tends to arrive somewhere. And according to recent reports, it has arrived somewhere now. The new developments in Nancy Guthrie's case didn't come with a press conference or a formal announcement. They came the way the most important things usually do, carefully, precisely, through channels that had been building toward this for far longer than most people realized. To understand what has changed, it helps to understand where things stood before. Because in a case like this, context isn't just background, context is the entire foundation. Before any of this became a story, there was just a life being lived. Nancy moved through her days the way most people do, with purpose, with responsibility, with a kind of quiet dignity that didn't ask to be noticed. People who knew her describe a woman who was thoughtful, who was careful, someone who took the things she committed to seriously and who expected the same from the people she allowed close. She was not someone who trusted easily, that matters. She had lived enough to understand that trust isn't something you extend by default, it is something you give deliberately after time, after proof. And yet, like most people, she extended it. To certain people, to certain structures, to the systems that were supposed to be on her side, because that is what living in the world requires. A kind of faith that things will hold the way they are meant to hold. For a while they did. The community she moved through was unremarkable in the way that places are unremarkable before something happens to define them. people knew each other. There were friendships and tensions and histories between people that stretched back years. Nancy existed inside all of that the way anyone does, as someone with her own view of things, her own version of the story, her own reasons for the choices she made each day. What wasn't visible not to anyone on the outside, and perhaps not even fully to Nancy, was what was accumulating underneath all of it. According to accounts that have since come forward, there were pressures in her world that never broke the surface in any obvious way. No arguments that carried through walls. No conflicts that made it into public view. Just a particular kind of internal weight, the kind that gathers slowly and privately and doesn't announce itself until something finally forces it upward. The people who were close to her during that period have described, carefully and in limited terms, a woman who was moving through something she hadn't yet found words for. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't any danger she could point to, it was something quieter than that, something unsettled, something that sat just underneath the normal surface of her days without ever quite resolving. In hindsight, it is tempting to look at that time and see what was coming, but hindsight is a luxury the moment doesn't offer. In the moment, life still looked mostly like itself, familiar. Continuous, moving forward, that stability, it turned out, was not as solid as it appeared. The first signal that something was wrong didn't come with noise, it came with silence. A particular kind of silence that the people who knew her best noticed and couldn't explain. Out of character. Unusual in a way that was hard to name but impossible to dismiss. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like rest. It felt, they would say later, like something holding its breath. Silence is not always what it appears to be, it can be peace. It can be distance or grief or the weight of something too complicated to speak. Most of the time when someone goes quiet, there is a perfectly ordinary explanation behind it. Someone needing space, needing time, needing something that the people around them simply cannot give. Most of the time, silence is just silence, but sometimes it is a signal. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the silence that came before everything else was noticed by the people closest to her and not immediately understood. They filed it away, carried it quietly. And when the time came to speak with investigators, they brought it back out, carefully, as part of a larger effort to reconstruct what had actually happened from the fragments left behind. The first significant development, according to reports, was not the kind of dramatic moment that cases like this are often portrayed as producing. There was no sudden revelation. No single piece of evidence that came crashing through the surface. It was something quieter than that, a discovery of the ordinary kind, the kind that tends to do the most damage to a version of events, because it doesn't match what was already on record. Investigators have stated that information came to light which raised new questions about the timeline surrounding Nancy's situation. The specifics have not been fully released. But sources familiar with the case have indicated that what emerged was significant enough to prompt something investigators are careful to do only when genuinely necessary: a re-examination of conclusions that had already been drawn. That decision carries weight. When investigators return to something they believed was settled, one of two things is usually true. Either something genuinely new has appeared, something that wasn't available before, or something old has been looked at from a different angle and revealed a meaning that wasn't recognized the first time. Both of those possibilities have been raised, according to people close to the investigation. Neither has been ruled out. What is clear is that the original account, the one most people had accepted, the version that had been filed and moved past, began to show its seams. Not at its center, not yet. But at the edges, where the details that were supposed to align did not quite align. And where the small contradictions that had always been there were suddenly receiving the attention they had long been denied. Those contradictions, some who followed the case closely have noted, were never invisible. They were simply not treated as important, not elevated, not examined with any real urgency. Now they were being examined, and the structure beneath them, once weight was applied, was beginning to move. There is a moment in any investigation when the questions stop being manageable. When they multiply faster than the answers can arrive. When something that appeared contained begins to expand in all directions, and the people involved, the investigators, the attorneys, the family members, the ones who have simply refused to stop caring, start to understand that the picture they were working with was incomplete. That the story had more rooms than they had been given access to. According to reports, that is precisely what began unfolding in the period leading up to the most recent developments in this case. Questions surfaced about certain relationships in Nancy's life, Not accusations. That distinction is important. Questions. The kind that appear when a timeline is examined carefully and one person's account doesn't line up with another's. The kind that emerge when records are set side by side and the records say something slightly different from what the people involved have said. The investigation moved into a new phase. Investigators have stated that multiple parties were re-interviewed, and that word re-interviewed deserves a moment of attention. It means people who had already spoken, who had already given their account, were brought back, asked to go through it again, given the opportunity to clarify, to add, to correct. What took place during those conversations has not been disclosed, but the fact that they happened is its own form of information. Running alongside that, a closer examination of communications and records, the kind of documentation that accumulates around any life. Often without anyone intending to create a record, reportedly revealed patterns that investigators considered significant enough to pursue. No formal conclusions have been attached to those findings. No official statement has declared what they mean, but questions have been raised, real ones. The kind that don't dissolve just because no one has answered them yet. For the people who actually knew Nancy, who loved her, who still carry her in the way that people carry someone they've lost, none of this was abstract. It was not procedural. To watch an investigation reopen, to hear that things considered settled are no longer settled. To understand that the truth surrounding someone you cared about may be different from the truth you were given, that is its own particular grief. Heavy and specific and not something that follows any clean emotional logic, it sits right next to hope, which makes it in some ways harder to carry, not easier. It came quietly. That is almost always how the turning points arrive in cases like this, not the way they look in dramatizations, with sudden reveals and rooms full of people reacting in unison. Real turning points are subtler than that. They arrive as information, careful, documented, verified, and they shift the center of gravity without anyone necessarily announcing that a shift has occurred. According to sources close to the investigation, a piece of evidence has emerged that investigators are describing, in measured terms, as material to the case. That word material is not one investigators use without intention. In legal and investigative contexts, it carries precise meaning. It means the evidence has substance. It has weight. It is the kind of thing that, placed alongside everything else already in the record, changes what the record is showing. The specific nature of that evidence has not been released. That is not an oversight. Cases at this stage are managed with deliberate care. What gets disclosed and when matters both legally and practically. Information released too early can compromise proceedings, alter the behavior of witnesses, shift outcomes in ways that can't be undone. The people managing this investigation understand that. The silence around certain details is not absence, it is restraint. What has been reported by those with genuine proximity to the case is that the evidence in question casts a new light on something that was previously considered explained. Something that, when it first appeared in the record, was accepted at face value. Filed, moved past, treated as understood, it was not fully understood. For Nancy's family, this development arrived with a particular kind of force. The kind that comes when something you've been waiting for, something you held onto even when no one seemed to be listening, finally surfaces. They have spoken carefully and sparingly about their belief that more was always there, that the case had never told its complete story. They didn't say it loudly. They said it the way people say things when they're not sure anyone is listening, quietly, persistently, to whoever would stay in the room long enough to hear. Someone stayed, someone listened. And what that listening has uncovered is now pointing the investigation in a direction it had never previously faced. No conclusion has been reached, that must be said plainly. This remains an open, developing situation, and where it ends is genuinely uncertain. But the direction it is moving is no longer the direction it was moving before. Something real has changed. And in a case like Nancy Guthrie's, real change is significant enough that it deserves to be held carefully and examined with honesty. The deeper an investigation goes, the more complicated the truth tends to become. That is not a sign that the truth is out of reach. It is a sign that it was layered, arranged, perhaps carefully, beneath a surface version of events that held together well enough to be accepted while something else entirely sat underneath. According to reports, investigators are now looking at dimensions of this case that were not part of the original inquiry. Relationships, financial records, patterns in communication. Timelines that were not initially treated as significant. Why those dimensions were not examined earlier, whether that reflects limited resources, a narrowed focus, or something harder to explain, has itself become a question that people are beginning to ask formally and on the record. That question has not yet been answered. What can be said, based on what has been reported, is that this case is no longer being treated as a closed matter. It is being treated as something alive. Something still in motion. Something that requires more honesty, more scrutiny, and more sustained attention than it has received. For the journalists, legal analysts, and advocates who have followed cases like this over many years, the recent developments carry two feelings that don't sit comfortably together. There is encouragement, because the system, for all its slowness and imperfection, appears to be doing something. And there is a particular, uncomfortable sobriety that comes from asking why it took this long, why these questions weren't raised sooner. What it means that a case can carry this many unexamined layers without anyone being required to look. Beneath all of it, beneath every report, every re-interview, every document now being examined with fresh eyes, is a person. Nancy Guthrie, before she became a case, before her name appeared in files and courtrooms and online forums where people argued about what happened, was a person with a life she was living. With people who loved her, with a sense of what her future might hold. What happened to that future, what interrupted it, what surrounded it, what the actual truth of it is, remains the question that has never been fully answered. It is the question at the center of everything happening now. The investigation continues, the work continues. And the people who never stopped paying attention, quietly without recognition across years of waiting, are still watching. With the particular hard-earned patience of those who understand that truth, when it finally comes, rarely announces itself in advance. There is a weight that belongs to a case that refuses to close. It isn't dramatic, it doesn't demand attention. It simply persists, pressing quietly against whatever has been officially said, refusing to dissolve. Staying present in a way that feels less like stubbornness and more like something unfinished that knows it is unfinished. Nancy Guthrie's case has carried that weight for a long time. And the people who have carried it alongside her, her family, the people who knew her before any of this, the people who simply couldn't accept the silence, have done so without recognition and without certainty. With nothing but the belief that continuing to ask is better than learning to live with unanswered things. The developments unfolding now do not answer everything. They were never going to. What they represent is the beginning of a different chapter, not the last one, but a new one which is more than this case has had for a long time. There is still work ahead. Still information to process. Still decisions to be made by people with the authority to make them, but something has shifted. And for the people to whom Nancy's name is not a case title but a memory, a real person they still carry somewhere, that shift is not small. It is not procedural. It is the thing they have been waiting for. Cases like this remind us that justice doesn't arrive in a single moment. It is built slowly from persistence and honesty, and from the willingness of at least one person to keep asking even when the room has emptied. It requires the system to eventually do what it exists to do, even when it takes far longer than it should. It requires someone to stay, someone stayed. And now, carefully and without fanfare, the answer that was always there, underneath everything, beneath every version of the story that didn't quite hold, appears to be forming. Whatever the full truth of Nancy Guthrie's case turns out to be, what matters in this moment is that it is finally being treated with the seriousness it deserved from the beginning. That the questions are being taken seriously, that the people who loved her are no longer being asked to wait in silence. That is not the ending, but it is something real. And in cases like this, something real is exactly where everything begins. If this case has stayed with you, if something about Nancy's story settled into you in a way that's hard to explain, you're not alone in that. These stories matter not because they are dramatic, but because they are deeply, undeniably human. Because behind every case file, behind every report and re-interview and unanswered question, there is a life that deserved better. If you've followed this case for a while, or if today was the first time you heard Nancy's name, take a moment and leave your thoughts below. Not conclusions, not judgment. Just what you're sitting with. And if this kind of storytelling means something to you, subscribing means you'll be here when the next development comes. Because in cases like this, the next development is rarely as far away as it seems.